Welcome to the online course on the Nibbāna Sermons 12 to 22 by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda, a collaboration between the Numata Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of Hamburg and the Barre Center for Buddhist Studies in Massachusetts. And today we'll be looking at sermon number 15. But before that, there were a few comments from the very rich online discussion that I just wanted to briefly pick up. And again, I can't really do justice to all that has been said there, so they're just a few extracts. One thing that I really found helpful was a comment still on the Majjhima Nikaya 1, the Mula Pariyaya Sutta by Alexei Novak. He said maybe the monk's unusual response fits with the theme of the discourse, and they not only understood but are putting the teaching into practice here, taking it with equanimity rather than delight. And I have to admit, it never occurred to me that to look at it in this light. So again, just to recapitulate, the discourse has the rather unusual ending that the monks did not delight in the teaching given by the Buddha. And this unusual ending is in fact also found in an Ekotarika Agama parallel. And together this is also interesting from the viewpoint of oral and textual transmission. It really shows that this very unusual ending did not get deleted or erased during oral transmission, but was maintained. And the commentary thinks that this means that they did not understand what the Buddha had taught them. But I think, as Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda pointed out, this is not a very convincing explanation. In fact, in my own experience in Sri Lanka, when others listen to some profound discourse and they don't understand it, they will usually still delight in it. They say, "Oh, it was so wonderful. I didn't really understand what the Venerable was talking about, but it was great." So I think that this explanation is not so convincing, and Venerable Ñāṇananda rightly suggested that they probably did not delight because they understood, in the sense of they realized that this discourse was going at the very root of something that they might have been clinging to. But I find it very refreshing to follow the idea the proposed by Alexei, that they did not delight because, and it's the same word, they did not abhinandati. It's the same word that's also used in the instruction. They did not delight because that was what the Buddha had told them. Don't delight in anything. Don't even delight in Nibbāna, so also don't delight in the discourse. Then many participants commented on how useful they found the highlight placed on the dichotomy of internal and external. And I can only agree with that. To me also, this is a very important point, something that I really like to stress, as George pointed out from his experience of sitting courses with me. I really like to stress that with the contemplation of the elements, this the substantial difference we often create between internal and external really lacks a foundation. And Kim Allen also commented on the element meditation, that this contemplation of internal and external as identical is very powerful and indeed undermines the sense of self. And Katrina, she went a little bit more in detail on this. She says, the internal-external contemplation now appears to my mind as a two-step process. Step 1, meditatively contemplate the internal-external dichotomy of earth element until the distinction between internal and external falls away, until no viable case can be made for a difference. Step 2, connect the peacefulness of the disappearing duality to the imagery of the stopping of the vortex, which vividly points back to and reinforces the understanding about how the vortex is created. Yeah, I thought that was very, very, very helpful. I think I stop with comments from the discussion and move into the actual sermon number 15. Etang santang etang panitang yadidang sab sankhara samato sab upari parinisaggo tanhakayo virago nirodho nibbānam. This is peaceful, this is excellent, namely the stilling of all preparations, the relinquishment of all assets, the destruction of craving, detachment, cessation, extinction. With the permission of the most venerable great preceptor and the assembly of the venerable meditative monks, this is the 15th sermon in the series of sermons on Nibbāna. Towards the end of our last sermon, we happened to quote a brief exhortation on Dhamma from the Udana, which enabled the ascetic Bahya Daruchirya to liberate his mind from imaginings and attain the state of non-identification, Attammayata, or Arahanthood. In order to attempt an exposition of that exhortation of the Buddha, which was pithy enough to bring about instantaneous Arahanthood, let us refresh our memory of that brief discourse to Bahya. Tasmātya te Bahya evang sikkitabbang, dinte dittamattang bhavisati, sutte sutamattang bhavisati, mutte mutamattang bhavisati, viññāte viññātamattang bhavisati. Evang ite Bahya sikkitabbang. Yato kote Bahya dinte dittamattang bhavisati, sutte sutamattang bhavisati, mutte mutamattang bhavisati, viññāte viññātamattang bhavisati, tato tvang bāyana tena. Yato tvang bāyana tena, tato tvang bāyana tatta. Yato tvang bāyana tatta, tato tvang bāyane vidha na hurang na ubhaya mandarena. Ese vando dukkasa. Well then, Bahya, you had better train yourself thus. In the seen there will be just the seen. In the heard there will be just the heard. In the sensed there will be just the sensed. In the cognized there will be just the cognized. Thus Bahya should you train yourself. And when to your Bahya there will be in the seen just the seen, in the heard just the heard, in the sensed just the sensed, in the cognized just the cognized, then Bahya you will not be by it. And when Bahya you are not by it, then Bahya you are not in it. And when Bahya you are not in it, then Bahya you are neither here nor there nor in between. This itself is the end of suffering. Comment, and here just a translation by Ireland. Here in Bahya you should train yourself thus. In the seen will be merely what is seen. In the heard will be merely what is heard. In the sensed will be merely what is sensed. In the cognized will be merely what is cognized. In this way you should train yourself, Bahya. When Bahya in the seen is merely what is seen, in the heard is merely what is heard, in the sensed is merely what is sensed, in the cognized is merely what is cognized, then Bahya you will not be with that. When Bahya you are not with that, then Bahya you will not be in that. When Bahya you are not in that, then Bahya you will be neither here nor beyond nor in between the two. Just this is the end of suffering. End of comment. As a clue to an exegesis of this discourse, we made an attempt the other day to unravel the meaning of the two puzzling terms in this text, namely natena and na tatta. These two terms are apparently unrelated to the context. To get at their significance, we brought up a quotation of 2 lines from the Jara Sutta of the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipāta. Dhono nahitina manyati yaridang ditta sutang mote suha. Comment, translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. One cleansed does not thereby conceive things seen, heard, or sensed. I also wanted to mention that there is another passage that can also be taken into account as an exegesis of the Bahya Sutta, and that is the exactly same instruction, in fact, given to Malankya-Putta in the Samyutta Nikaya. And as an additional reading for those of you who are interested, this week I'll offer a PDF of my book on compassion and emptiness, and there on pages 110 to 114 you find the translation of the Chinese parallel to this instruction to Malankya-Putta. This is really we could consider it a canonical commentary on the implications of this succinct instruction. And I'm also in the process of publishing a paper and maybe writing still another paper on this instruction. The first paper is basically an attempt to argue that this instruction to Bahya and to Malankya-Putta is a form of bare awareness. This has been, the term bare awareness or bare attention has been used by Venerable Nyanaponika Thera, and he has been criticized for that, and I am kind of arguing that this criticism is not entirely justified. And I have a second paper in preparation on the relationship between such instructions and the whole way we construct our experience from the viewpoint of early Buddhism and from the viewpoint of cognitive psychology. So I think these two papers will not be ready by the time we are doing this course, but I hope to come back to this topic at the beginning of next year. That will be sermon 23, I think, yeah. So when we start next year again, and I hope you will all be still with us, then I would come back to this, the Malankya-Putta instruction, its implications as an exegesis on the Bahya Sutta. But for now, all I can offer is just this short extract, pages 110 to 114, from my book on compassion and emptiness. And this is by now, due to the copyright, I'm free now to share it, the PDF. End of comment. Dhona is a term for the Arahant in the sense that he has shaken off the dust of defilements. So then these two lines imply that the Arahant does not imagine thereby, namely Yadidang, in terms of whatever is seen, heard, or sensed. These two lines are, as it were, a random exegesis of our riddle terms in the Bahya Sutta. The first line itself gives the clue to the rather elliptical term natena, which carries no verb with it. Our quotation makes it clear that the implication is manyana, or imagining. Dhono nahi tena manyati. The Arahant does not imagine by it or thereby. Although the Bahya Sutta makes no mention of the word manyana, this particular expression seems to suggest that what is implied here is a form of imagining. By way of further proof, we may allude to another quotation, which we had to bring up several times. Yena hi manyanti tatotang hoti anyatha. In whatever terms they imagine it, thereby it turns otherwise. We came across another expression which has a similar connotation. Tenacha ma manyi, do not be vain thereby. The first thing we can infer, therefore, from the above quoted two lines of the verse is that what is to be understood by the elliptical expression natena in the Bahya Sutta is the idea of imagining, or in short, natena manyati, does not imagine thereby. Secondly, as to what precisely is implied by the word tena, or by it, can also be easily inferred from those two lines. In fact, the second line, beginning with the word yadidang, which means namely or that is, looks like a commentary on the first line itself. The dhono, or the Arahant, does not imagine thereby, namely by whatever is seen, heard, and sensed. The verse in question mentions only the three terms Ditta, Sutta, and Mutta, whereas the Barre Sutta has as its framework the four terms Ditta, Sutta, Mutta, and Viññāta. Since what precedes the term Naten in the Barre Sutta is the fourfold premise beginning with Ditte Dittamatang Bhavisati, when to you, Bahya, there will be in the scene just the scene, it stands to reason that what the Buddha meant by the term Natena is the attitude of not thinking in terms of whatever is seen, heard, sensed, or cognized. That is to say, not imagining thereby. This same attitude of not imagining thereby is what is upheld in the Mula Pariyaya Sutta, which we discussed at length on a previous occasion. There we explained the word manjana, me thinking, imagining, taking as a paradigm the first term patavi, occurring in the list of 24 terms given there. Among the 24 terms we find mentioned the four relevant to our present problem, namely Ditta, Sutta, Mutta, and Viññāta. We are now used to the general schema of the Mula Pariyaya Sutta concerning the attitude of the three categories of persons mentioned there. Let us, for instance, take up what is said in that context with regard to the Seka, or the monk in higher training. Pataving padavitu abhiññāya, pataving māmaññi, pataviya māmaññi, padavito māmaññi, pataving meti māmaññi, pataving mā abhinandi. Comment, translation by Ñāṇamoli. He directly knows earth as earth. Having directly known earth as earth, he should not conceive himself as earth. He should not conceive himself in earth. He should not conceive himself apart from earth. He should not conceive earth to be mine. He should not delight in earth. End of comment. This is how the attitude of the Seka is described with regard to Patavi, or earth. Suppose we substitute Ditta, or the scene, in place of Patavi. This is what we should get. Dittang dittato abhiññāya, dittang māmaññi, dittasming māmaññi, dittato māmaññi, dittang meti māmaññi, dittang mā abhinandi. What the Seka has before him is a step of training, and this is how he has to train in respect of the four things, the seen, the heard, the sensed, and the cognized. He should not imagine in terms of them. For instance, he understands through higher knowledge, and not through the ordinary perception of the worldling, the seen as seen. Having thus understood it, he has to train in not imagining the seen as a thing, by objectifying it. Dittang māmaññi, let him not imagine a scene. Also, let him not imagine in the scene, or from the scene. We have already pointed out the relationship between these imaginings and the grammatical structure. This objectification of the scene gives rise to acquisitive tendencies, to imagine the scene as mine. Dittang meti māmaññi, let him not imagine I have seen, or I have a seen. This acquisition has something congratulatory about it. It leads to some sort of joy, so the monk in higher training has to combat that too. Dittang mā abhinandi, let him not delight in the scene. It seems then that the Buddha has addressed the ascetic Bahya Daruchirya in the language of the Aryans. For the very first instruction given to him was, in the scene there will be just the scene. So highly developed in wisdom and quick-witted was Bahya that the Buddha promptly asked him to stop short at the scene, by understanding that in the scene there is just the scene. Not to have imaginings or methinkings about the scene is therefore the way to stop short at just the scene. If one does not stop short at just the scene, but goes on imagining in terms of in the scene, from the scene, etc., as already stated, one will end up with an identification or tammayata. In our last sermon we brought up the term tammayata. When one starts imagining in such terms about something, one tends to become one with it, tammayo. Even as things made out of gold and silver are called golden, suvarnamaya, and silvery, rajatamaya. It is as if one who grasps a gem becomes its owner, and if anything happens to the gem, he is affected by it. To possess a gem is to be possessed by it. When one gets attached and becomes involved and entangled in the scene through craving, conceit, and views, by imagining egoistically, the result is identification, tammayata, literally of thatness. In this present context, however, the Buddha puts Bahya Daruchirya on the path to non-identification or attammayata. That is to say, he advises Bahya not to indulge in such imaginings. That attitude leads to non-identification and detachment. When one has no attachments, involvements, and entanglements regarding the scene, one does not have the notion of being in the scene. Once we spoke about the children's hut into which the mother was invited. When she crept into that plaything of a hut, she did not seriously entertain the thought of being in it. Similarly, if one does not indulge in imaginings, one has no notion of being in the scene. This then is the significance of the words natatta, not in it. Yatutvang bhaya natena, tatutvang bhaya natatta. When bhaya you are not by it, then bhaya you are not in it. That is to say, when for instance Bhaya does not imagine by the scene, he is not in the scene. Likewise, he is not in the heard, sensed or cognized. From this we can deduce the meaning of what follows. Yatutvang Bhaya na tatta, tatutvang Bhaya nividha nahurang na ubhayam antarena. At whatever moment you neither imagine by the scene, nor entertain the notion of being in the scene, which is tantamount to projecting an eye into the scene, then you are neither here, nor there, nor in between. In a number of earlier sermons, we have sufficiently explained the significance of the two ends and the middle, as well as the above, the below, and the across in the middle. What do they signify? As we happened to point out on an earlier occasion, it is by driving the peg of the conceit M that the world is measured out, construed, or postulated. We also pointed out that the grammatical structure springs up along with it. That is to say, together with the notion am, there arises a here. Here am I. He is there, and you are yon, or in front of me. This is the basic ground plan for the grammatical structure, known to grammar as the first person, the second person, and the third person. A world comes to be measured out, and a grammatical structure springs up. This, in fact, is the origin of proliferation or papancha. So it is the freedom from that proliferation that is meant by the expression nevida, nahurang, na ubhaya mantarena. Neither here, nor there, nor between the two. The notion of one's being in the world, or the bifurcation as I and the world, is no longer there. Ese vanto dukkhassa. This then is the end of suffering, Nibbāna. The fundamental first principles underlying this short exhortation of the Buddha could thus be inferred to some extent. We could perhaps elicit something more regarding the significance of the four key terms in question. In this section of the fours in the Anguttara Nikaya, we come across four modes of noble usages, Chattaro Arya Vihara, namely Ditte Dittavarita, Sutte Suttavarita, Murte Mutavarita, Viññāte Viññātavarita. These four are asserting the fact of having seen in regard to the seen, asserting the fact of having heard in regard to the heard, asserting the fact of having sensed in regard to the sensed, asserting the fact of having cognized in regard to the cognized. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Saying that one has seen what one has seen, saying that one has heard what one has heard, saying that one has sensed what one has sensed, saying that one has cognized what one has cognized. These are the four noble declarations. I just want to mention that this is the last of four such passages, and two of which are ignoble declarations, which is asserting the opposite of what one has seen and not seen, and one noble declaration, which is asserting that one has not seen what one has not seen, etc. End of comment. Generally speaking, these four noble usages stand for the principle of truthfulness. In some discourses, as well as in the Vinaya Pitaka, these terms are used in that sense. They are the criteria of the veracity of a statement in general, not so much in a deep sense. However, there are different levels of truth. In fact, truthfulness is a question of giving evidence that runs parallel with one's level of experience. At higher levels of experience or realization, the evidence one gives also changes accordingly. The episode of Venerable Mahathir is a case in view. When he met a certain woman on his way who displayed her teeth in a wily giggle, he simply grasped the sign of her teeth. He did not totally refrain from grasping a sign, but took it as an illustration of his meditation subject. Later, when that woman's husband, searching for her, came up to him and asked whether he had seen a woman, he replied that all he saw was a skeleton. Now that is a certain level of experience. Similarly, the concept of truthfulness is something that changes with levels of experience. There are various degrees of truth based on realization. The highest among them is called Paramasatya. As to what that is, the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta itself provides the answer in the following statement of the Buddha. Etan hi bhikkhu paramang aryasachang yaridang amosa dhammang nibbāna. Monk, this is the highest noble truth, namely Nibbāna, that is of a non-falsifying nature. Commented translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. For this Bhikkhu is the supreme noble truth, namely Nibbāna, which has an undeceptive nature. And I wanted to add also that this passage is helpful to put into context a tendency prevalent among some scholars and also Dharma teachers of interpreting Satya as not meaning truth. It is taken to be just referring to a reality, or in some other way it is translated in a way that does not conflict with current attitude in the West of disdaining any type of truth claim made on religious grounds. And although I understand this tendency, I think it is not an adequate reflection of what we find in the early discourses, where at times Satya does mean truth. And this is particularly the case here is a good example. This is Arya Satya. And its contrast to Amosa Dhamma is so evident that this must mean a truth. And I also think that the four Arya Satyani, taught according to tradition, the first teaching delivered by the Buddha, are not just about realities, but they actually, the sense that I get is really that they are four noble truths, similar to the context here. End of comment. All other truths are falsified when the corresponding level of experience is transcended. But Nibbāna is the highest truth, since it can never be falsified by anything beyond it. The fact that it is possible to give evidence by this highest level of experience comes to light in the Cambisudhana Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya. In this discourse, we find the Buddha instructing the monks as to how they should interrogate a fellow monk who claims to have attained arahanthood. The interrogation has to follow certain criteria, one of which concerns the four standpoints, ditta, sutta, mutta, and viññāta, the seen, the heard, the sensed, and the cognized. What sort of answer a monk who rightly claims to arahanthood would give is also stated there by the Buddha. It runs as follows. Ditte kohang avoso anupayo anapayo anisito appatibaddho vimpamutto visangyato vimaryarika tena cetasa viharami. Here then is the highest mode of giving evidence in the court of reality as an arahant. Friends, with regard to the seen, I dwell unattracted, unrepelled, independent, uninvolved, released, unshackled, with the mind free from barriers. Translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. Friends, regarding the seen, I abide unattracted, unrepelled, independent, detached, free, dissociated, with the mind rid of barriers. End of comment. He is unattracted, anupayo, by lust, and unrepelled, anapayo, by hate. He is not dependent, anisito, on cravings, conceits, and views. He is not involved, appatibadho, with desires and attachments, and is released, vipamutto, from defilements. He is no longer shackled, visangyutto, by fetters, and his mind is free from barriers. What these barriers are we can easily infer. They are the bifurcations, such as the internal and the external, ajhata and bahidda, which are so basic to what is called existence, bhava. Where there are barriers, there are also attachments, aversions, and conflicts. Where there is offense, there is defense and offense. Comment. Yeah, I really like this last wordplay by the Venerable, where there's offense, there's defense and offense. And I think it also clarifies again that he's not about the basic distinction between internal and external, but about creating a fundamental dichotomy between the two, of not seeing the interrelatedness, of making it into a fence. End of comment. So the Arahant dwells with the mind unpartitioned and barrierless, vimaryadikatena cetasa. To be able to make such a statement is the highest standard of giving evidence in regard to the Four Noble Usages. It is also noteworthy that in the Bahya Sutta the Buddha has presented the triple training of higher morality, higher concentration, and higher wisdom, Adi Sila, Adi Citta, and Adi Panya, for these Four Noble Usages. The commentary too accepts this fact. But this is a point that might need clarification. How are we to distinguish between morality, concentration, and wisdom in this brief exhortation? Now, how does the exhortation begin? It opens with the words Tasmat yati bahya evang sikkitabang. Well then, bahya, you should train yourself thus. This is an indication that the Buddha introduced him to a course of training, and this is the preliminary training. Dinde diddhamattang bhavisati, sute sutamattang bhavisati, mute mutamattang bhavisati, viññāte viññātamattang bhavisati. In the seen there will be just the seen, in the heard there will be just the heard, in the sense there will be just the sensed, in the cognized there will be just the cognized. What is hinted at by this initial instruction is the training in higher morality, adi sila sikka. The most important aspect of this training is the morality of sense restraint, indriya samvara sila. The first principles of sense restraint are already implicit in this brief instruction. If one stops short at just the seen in regard to the seen, one does not grasp a sign in it, or dwell on its details. There is no sorting out as this is good, this is bad. That itself conduces to sense restraint. So we may conclude that the relevance of this brief instruction to the morality of sense restraint is in its enjoining the abstention from grasping a sign or dwelling on the details. That is what pertains to the training in higher morality, adi sila sikka. Let us see how it also serves the purpose of training in higher concentration. To stop at just the seen in the seen is to refrain from discursive thought, which is the way to abundant mental hindrances. It is discursive thought that brings hindrances in its train. So here we have what is relevant to the training in higher concentration as well. Then what about higher wisdom, madhipanya? Something more specific has to be said in this concern. What precisely is to be understood by higher wisdom in this context? It is actually the freedom from imaginings, manana, and proliferation, papancha. If one stops short at just the seen in the seen, such ramifications as mentioned in discourses like the Mula Pariyaya Sutta do not come in at all. The tendency to objectify the seen and to proliferate it as in it, from it, and it is mine, receives no sanction. This course of training is helpful for the emancipation of the mind from imaginings and proliferations. The Buddha has compared the six sense spaces, that is, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, to a deserted village. Sunyang idang attena vatantanyena va. This is void of a self or anything belonging to a self. All these sense spaces are devoid of a self or anything belonging to a self. Therefore, they are comparable to a deserted village, a village from which all inhabitants have fled. The dictum "in the scene there will be just the scene" is an advice, conducive to the attitude of regarding the six sense spaces as a deserted village. This is what pertains to higher wisdom in the Buddha's exhortation. Papancha, or prolific conceptualization, is a process of transaction with whatever is seen, heard, sensed, etc. So here there is no process of such transaction. Also, when one trains oneself according to the instruction, in the seen there will be just the seen, in the heard there will be just the heard, in the sensed there will be just the sensed, in the cognized there will be just the cognized, that identification implied by the term tammayata will no longer be there. Egotism, the conceit M, and all what prompts conceptual proliferation will come to an end. This kind of training uproots the peg of the conceit M, thereby bringing about the cessation of prolific conceptualization, the cessation of becoming, and the cessation of suffering. We can therefore conclude that the entire triple training is enshrined in this exhortation. What happens as a result of this training is indicated by the riddle-like terms natena, natata, nevidha, nahurang, naubhaya mantarena. When the wisdom of the ascetic Bahya Daruchirya had sufficiently matured by following the triple course of training, the Buddha gave the hint necessary for realization of that cessation of becoming, which is Nibbāna, in the following words. Then Bahya, you will not be by it. And when Bahya, you are not by it, then Bahya, you are not in it. And when Bahya, you are not in it, then Bahya, you are neither here, nor there, nor in between. This itself is the end of suffering. This sermon, therefore, is one that succinctly presents the quintessence of the Saddhamma. It is said that the mind of the ascetic Bahya Daruchirya was released from all influxes immediately on hearing this exhortation. Now let us come back to the sequence of events in the story as mentioned in the Udana. It was after the Buddha had always set out on his alms round that this sermon was almost wrenched from him with much insistence. When it had proved its worth, the Buddha continued with his alms round. Just then a cow with a young calf gored the Bahya Daruchirya to death. While returning from his alms round with a group of monks, the Buddha saw the corpse of the Bahya. He asked those monks to take the dead body on a bed and cremate it. He even told them to build a cairn, enshrining his relics, saying, "Monks, a co-celibate of yours has passed away." Those monks, having carried out the instructions, came back and reported to the Buddha. Then they raised the question, "Where has he gone after death? What is his after-death state?" The Buddha replied, "Monks, Bahya Daruchirya was wise. He lived up to the norm of the Dhamma. He did not harass me with questions on Dhamma. Monks, Bahya Daruchirya has attained Parinibbāna." In conclusion, the Buddha uttered the following verse of uplift. Yata apocha patavi techo vayana gadhati na tata sukha jotanti aditcho napakasati na tata chandi ma bhati tamo tatana vinjati yadacha attanavedi muni munina brahmano atha rupa arupa cha sukha dukkha pamunchati. On the face of it, the verse seems to imply something like this. Where water, earth, fire, and air do not find a footing, there the stars do not shine, and the sun spreads not its lustre. The moon does not appear resplendent there, and no darkness is to be found there. When the sage, the Brahmin with wisdom, understands by himself, then he is freed from form and formless, and from pleasure and pain as well. Comment, translation by Ireland. Where neither water nor yet earth, nor fire nor air gain a foothold, there gleam no stars, no sun sheds light. There shines no moon, yet there no darkness reigns. When a sage or Brahmin has come to know this, for himself through his own experience, then he is freed from form and formless, freed from pleasure and from pain. End of comment. The commentary to the Dana, Paramattadipani, gives a strange interpretation to this verse. It interprets the verse as a description of the destination of the Arambaya Daruchirya after he attained Parinibbana, the place he went to. Even the term Nibbāna Gati is used in that connection, the place one goes to in attaining Parinibbana. That place, according to the commentary, is not easily understood by worldlings. Its characteristics are said to be the following. The four elements, earth, water, fire and air, are not there. No sun or moon or stars are there. The reason why the four elements are negated is supposed to be the fact that there is nothing that is compounded in the uncompounded Nibbāna element into which the Arahant passes away. Since no sun or moon or stars are there in that mysterious place, one might wonder why there is no darkness either. The commentator tries to forestall the objection by stating that it is precisely because one might think that there should be darkness, when those luminaries are not there, that the Buddha emphatically negates it. So the commentary interpretation apparently leads us to the conclusion that there is no darkness in the Nibbāna element, even though no sun or moon or stars are there. The line of interpretation we have followed throughout this series of sermons allows us to depart from this commentarial trend. That place where earth, water, fire and air do not find a footing is not where the Arambaya Daruchirya had gone when he passed away. The commentator seems to have construed this verse as a reply the Buddha gave to the question raised by those monks. Their question was, where has he gone after death? What is his after-death state? They were curious about his born. But when we carefully examine the context, it becomes clear that they raised that question because they did not know that the corpse they cremated was that of an Arahant. Had they known it, they would not have even asked that question. That is precisely the reason for the Buddha's declaration that Bhāya attained Parinibbāna, a fact he had not disclosed before. He added that Bhāya followed the path of Dhamma without harassing him with questions and attained Parinibbāna. Now that is the answer proper. To reveal the fact that Bhāya attained Parinibbāna is to answer the question put by those inquisitive monks. Obviously they knew enough of the Dhamma to understand then that their question about the born and destiny of Venerable Bhāya was totally irrelevant. So then the verse uttered by the Buddha in conclusion was something extra. It was only a joyous utterance, a verse of uplift, coming as a grand finale to the whole episode. Such verses of uplift are often to be met with in the Udana. As we already mentioned, the verses in the Udana have to be interpreted very carefully, because they go far beyond the implications of the story concerned. They invite us to take a plunge into the ocean of Dhamma. Just one verse is enough. The text is small but deep. The verse in question is such a spontaneous utterance of joy. It is not the answer to the question, where did he go? Well, in that case, what are we to understand by the word yatta, where? We have already given a clue to it in our 7th sermon with reference to that non-manifestative consciousness, Anidassana Vijñāna. What the Buddha describes in this verse is not the place where the Venerable Arahant Bhāya went after his demise, but the non-manifestative consciousness he had realized here and now in his concentration of the fruit of Arahanthood, Arattapala Samadhi. Let us hark back to the 4 lines quoted in the Kevaddha Sutta. Vijñānaṃ anidassanam anantaṃ savatopabhaṃ etta apocha padavi techo vayona gadati. Consciousness which is non-manifestative, endless, lustrous on all sides, it is here that water, earth, fire and air no footing find. Comment, translation by Walsh. Where consciousness is signless, boundless, or luminous, that's where earth, water, fire and air find no footing. End of comment. The first two lines of the verse in the Barre Sutta, beginning with the correlative yatta, where, find an answer in the last two lines quoted above from the Kevadanda Sutta. What is referred to as "it is here" is obviously the non-manifestative consciousness mentioned in the first two lines. That problematic place indicated by the word yatta, where, in the Barre Sutta, is none other than this non-manifestative consciousness. We had occasion to explain at length in what sense earth, water, fire, and air find no footing in that consciousness. The ghostly elements do not haunt that consciousness. That much is clear. But how are we to understand the enigmatic reference to the sun, the moon, and the stars? It is said that the stars do not shine in that non-manifestative consciousness. The sun does not spread its luster, and the moon does not appear resplendent in it, nor is there any darkness. How are we to construe all this? Briefly stated, the Buddha's declaration amounts to the revelation that the sun, the moon, and the stars fade away before the superior radiance of the non-manifestative consciousness, which is infinite and lustrous on all sides. How a lesser radiance fades away before a superior one, we have already explained with reference to the cinema in a number of earlier sermons. To sum up, the attention of the audience in a cinema is directed to the narrow beam of light falling on the screen. The audience, or the spectators, are seeing the scenes making up the film show with the help of that beam of light and the thick darkness around. And this second factor is also very important. Scenes appear not simply because of the beam of light. The thickness of the darkness around is also instrumental in it. This fact is revealed when the cinema hall is fully lit up. If the cinema hall is suddenly illuminated, either by the opening of doors and windows or by some electrical device, the scenes falling on the screen fade away as if they were erased. The beam of light which was earlier there becomes dim before the superior light. The lesser luster is superseded by a greater luster. We might sometimes be found fault with for harping on this cinema simile, on the ground that it impinges on the precept concerning abstinence from enjoying dramatic performances, song, and music. But let us consider whether this cinema is something confined to the cinema hall. In the open-air theatre of the world before us, a similar phenomenon of supersedence is occurring. In the twilight glow of the evening, the twinkling stars enable us to faintly figure out the objects around us, despite the growing darkness. Then the moon comes up. Now what happens to the twinkling little stars? They fade away, their luster being superseded by that of the moon. Then we begin to enjoy the charming scenes before us in the serene moonlit night. The night passes off. The daylight gleam of the sun comes up. What happens then? The soft radiance of the moon wanes before the majestic luster of the sun. The moon gets superseded and fades away. Full of confidence, we are now watching the multitude of technicolored scenes in this massive theatre of the world. In broad daylight, when sunshine is there, we have no doubt about our vision of objects around us. But now let us suppose that the extraneous defilements in the mind of a noble disciple, treading the Noble Eightfold Path, get dispelled, allowing its intrinsic luster of wisdom to shine forth. What happens then? The stars, the moon, and the sun get superseded by that light of wisdom. Even the forms that one had seen by twilight, moonlight, and sunlight fade away and pale into insignificance. The umbra of form and the penumbra of the formless get fully erased. In the previous sermon, we happened to mention that form and space are related to each other, like the picture and its background. Now all this is happening in the firmament, which forms the background. We could enjoy the scenes of the world cinema because of that darkness. The twilight, the moonlight, and the sunlight are but various levels of that darkness. The worldling thinks that one who has eyes must surely see if there is sunshine. He cannot think of anything beyond it. But the Buddha has declared that there is something more radiant than the radiance of the sun. Nati panya sama abha. There is no radiance comparable to wisdom. Let us hark back to a declaration by the Buddha we had already quoted in a previous sermon. Chattasso ima bhikkhave pabha, katame chattasso. Chandam pabha, suryam pabha, angi pabha, panya pabha. Ima ko bhikkhave chattasso pabha. Etadagang bhikkhave masang chattunang pabhanang yadidang panya pabha. Monks, they are these four lusters. What for? The luster of the moon, the luster of the sun, the luster of fire, the luster of wisdom. These monks are the four lusters. This monk is the highest among these four lusters, namely the luster of wisdom. Comment. Translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Because there are these four splendors. What for? The splendor of the moon, the splendor of the sun, the splendor of fire, and the splendor of wisdom. These are the four splendors. Of these four splendors, the splendor of wisdom is foremost. Yeah, at this point, I would like to present my own understanding, which I am compelled to differ to some degree from the presentation of Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. And I would like to be very clear that there's no claim on my side that I must be right and correct. It is simply a different perspective on the significance of this passage in relation to the Barre instruction and a somewhat different understanding of the implications of that final passage. And I simply offer it for your consideration, and please just feel free to dismiss it if it doesn't make sense to you. So my personal take is that this reference to the pabha of wisdom, the luster or splendor of wisdom, is only metaphorical. And I have here another passage from the Samyutta Nikaya, where we get also the sun, moon, and fire. Abha, it is here, splendor. And there come the fourth one, then is the Buddha himself. So the Buddha is endowed with splendor that is superior to this sun, moon, and fire. And here's the translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. The Buddha is the best of all those that shine. He is the light unsurpassed. And I think this passage in the Samyutta Nikaya cannot be understood literally. I mean, it doesn't mean that the Buddha emanates some sort of light that is stronger than the light of the sun, the moon, and the fire. It must be metaphorical. And I think the same also applies to the above passage on wisdom. And I see both passages as probably being in dialogue with an idea that we find attested in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It's 436. And this is an Upanishad that is very early. We know it is earlier than the period of the Buddha. And so this passage states that the light of the Atman, the self, is superior to the sun, the moon, and the fire, and also to speech. So my own understanding is that the superiority of either wisdom or the Buddha over the sun, moon, and fire, or the stars, is meant to as a reply to this reification of the self that we find attested in the Brihadaranyaka, and therefore we know that this idea in some way must have been around in ancient India at a time even before the Buddha, and it makes it fairly probable that these passages could be a reply to that. This is as far as my understanding of this idea of the splendor of wisdom is concerned. Then, even taking literal or metaphorical, I don't see a relationship between this passage and the final verse in the Barre Sutta. The verse in the Barre Sutta speaks about different things that do not shine. It doesn't have any reference to anything that does shine. And moreover, when we think in terms of supersedence, if there is a weak source of light and then a stronger source of light comes and supersedes that, the weaker source of light is still shining. It is only that it is no longer visible. But the final verse in the Barre Sutta says that these do not shine. If there were some idea of supersedence, it should use different terminology. It should say their shine, their light is no longer evident or visible. So to me, this whole idea of bringing in some superior light that supersedes the light of the sun, the moon, and the stars is not convincing. And I see it simply as a description of, and there I fully agree with Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda, the experience of Nibbāna had by Barre. And the fact that the reference is to these, the sun, etc., not shining, instead of them not stating plainly they are just not there, also makes sense in my view, because if we just picture the situation, Barre is standing there out on the roads, he's getting this instruction, and then he has his attainment of Nibbāna. Now, even at the moment of his attainment of Nibbāna, the sun is still there. It's not that the sun has to disappear, but in his mind, the sun, the shining of the sun that he was experiencing right up to that moment when looking at the Buddha and listening to the Buddha, that sunshine doesn't reach anymore. It has no place to be. And so, in my view, it makes perfect sense for a description of the Nibbānic experience to say the sun does not shine. And the mention of there is also no darkness, I would read that in connection with the parallel passage from the Aggañña Sutta. This is, in my view, playful, but some people take it literal, a cosmology, a description of the evolution of the world after one of its cyclic destructions. And it describes that at first, when the world comes into being, there's only darkness, and sun, moon, and stars are not there. And here's the translation by Walsh. All was darkness, blinding darkness. Neither moon nor sun appeared, no constellations or stars appeared. So independent of what attitude we have towards this description, whether we take it as just a parable or as an actual description of something that happened, it is clear, I think, that there is this idea that at first there's only darkness and then sun, moon, and stars appear. And so if that idea is around, I think it makes perfect sense to say the sun does not shine and darkness is also not there in the final verse of the Barre Sutta, because in this way it is made clear that the experience being talked about is not some reverting to a primordial condition existing at the beginning of the evolution of the world, the evolution of an aeon. It's not that Nibbāna is sort of like going back to that time when the world was in existence but had not really fully evolved, but it's far beyond that. And so in my personal view, it makes perfect sense to point to the Nibbānic experience by saying, look, the four elements find no footing, sun, moon, etc., they don't shine. We are not saying that they are not there, they are there outside, whatever they do, but in that experience they have no chance to shine. And please don't mistake this experience for some sort of reverting to a primordial condition at the beginning of the genesis of the world. Darkness is also not there. Anyhow, this is just my personal take. As said before, please decide for yourself what you find more convincing and just dismiss what I said if it doesn't make sense to you. And this all is given with all the deep respect that I have for Venerable Ñāṇananda and the many things I have been able to learn from him. But from time to time, I just see things a little bit different. And I think in this case, this is particular because of my research on this, on the Kevada Sutta and also the Luminous Mind in the Anguttara Nikaya, where simply the comparative perspective that evolves through consulting the palates to the Pali discourses gives us another viewpoint. And from that viewpoint, it seems to me that the whole imagery of luminosity is not as relevant to discussions of the Nibbanic experience as it must naturally seem to be when one consults only the Pali discourses. End of comment. So then we can now understand why the form and the formless fade away. This wisdom has a penetrative quality, for which reason it is called Nibbēdika Paññā. When one sees forms, one sees them together with their shadows. The fact that one sees shadows there is itself proof that darkness has not been fully dispelled. If light comes from all directions, there is no shadow at all. If that light is of a penetrative nature, not even form will be manifest there. Nor it is mainly due to what is called form and formless, rupa arupa, that the worldling experiences pleasure and pain in a world that distinguishes between a pleasure and a pain. Though we have departed from the commentarial path of exegesis, we are now in a position to interpret the cryptic verse in the Barre Sutta perhaps more meaningfully. Let us now recall the verse in question. Yatta apocha patavi techo vayona gadati na tata sukha jotanti adijjo na bakasati na tata chandi ma bhati tamo tatana vinjati yadacha attanavedi muni munena brahmano atta rupa arupa cha sukha dukkha pamunchati. The verse can be fully explained along the lines of interpretation we have adopted. By way of further proof of the inadequacy of the commentarial explanation of the reference to the sun, the moon, and the stars in this verse, we may draw attention to the following points. According to the commentary, the verse is supposed to express that there are no sun, moon, or stars in that mysterious place called Anupadisesa Nibbāna Dhatu, which is incomprehensible to worldlings. We may, however, point out that the verbs used in the verse in this connection do not convey the sense that the sun, the moon, and the stars are simply non-existent there. They have something more to say. For instance, with regard to the stars, it is said that there the stars do not shine, na tata sukha jotanti. If in truth and fact the stars are not there, some other verb like na disanti are not seen or na vinjanti do not exist could have been used. With reference to the sun and the moon also, similar verbs could have been employed. But what we actually find here are verbs expressive of spreading light, shining, or appearing beautiful. Na tata sukha jotanti, there the stars do not shine. Adi jo na prakasati, the sun spreads not its luster. Na tat chandi ma bhati, the moon does not appear resplendent there. These are not mere prosaic statements. The verse in question is a joyous utterance, Uddana Gatha, of extraordinary depth. There is nothing recondite about it. In our earlier assessment of the commentary interpretation, we happened to lay special stress on the words even though. We are now going to explain the significance of that emphasis. For the commentary, the line Tamo tatta navinjati, no darkness is to be found there, is a big riddle. The sun, the moon, and the stars are not there. Even though they are not there, presumably, no darkness is to be found there. However, when we consider the law of superseding we have already mentioned, we are compelled to give a totally different interpretation. The sun, the moon, and the stars are not manifest precisely because of the light of that non-manifestative consciousness. As it is lustrous on all sides, sabbatupabha, There is no darkness there, and luminaries like the stars, the sun, and the moon do not shine there. This verse of uplift thus reveals a wealth of information relevant to our topic. Not only the exhortation to Barre, but this verse also throws a flood of light on the subject of Nibbāna. That extraordinary place, which the commentary often identifies with the term Anupadisesa Nibbāna Dhatu, is this mind of ours. It is in order to indicate the luminosity of this mind that the Buddha used those peculiar expressions in this verse of uplift. What actually happens in the attainment to the fruit of Arahanthood? The worldling discerns the world around him with the help of 6 narrow beams of light, namely the 6 sense spaces. When the superior lust of wisdom rises, those 6 sense spaces go down. The cessation of the 6 sense spaces could also be referred to as the cessation of name and form, nama rupa nirodha, or the cessation of consciousness, vijnana nirodha. The cessation of the 6 sense spaces does not mean that one does not see anything. What one sees then is voidness. It is an insight. One gives expression to it with the words, Sunyo loko, void is the world. What it means is that all the sense objects, which the worldling grasps as real and truly existing, get penetrated through with wisdom and become non-manifest. If we are to add something more to this interpretation of the Barre Sutta by way of review, we may say that this discourse illustrates the 6 qualities of the Dhamma, namely Svakakhatu, well proclaimed, Sanditthiko, visible here and now, Akaliko, timeless, Ehipassiko, well proclaimed, Sanditthiko, visible here and now, Akaliko, timeless, Ehipassiko, inviting to come and see, Opanayiko, leading onward, and Pacchattam Viditabbo Vinyuhi, to be realized by the wise, each one by himself. These 6 qualities are wonderfully exemplified by this discourse. In a previous sermon, we had occasion to bring up a simile of a dewdrop dazzling in the morning sunshine. The task of seeing the spectrum of rainbow colors through a tiny dewdrop hanging from a creeper or leaf is one that calls for a high degree of mindfulness. Simply by standing or sitting with one's face towards the rising sun, one will not be able to catch a glimpse of the brilliant spectrum of rainbow colors through the dewdrop. It requires a particular viewpoint. Only when one focuses on that viewpoint can one see it. So it is with the spectrum of the 6 qualities of the Dhamma. Here too the correct viewpoint is a must, and that is right view. Reflection on the meaning of deep discourses helps one to straighten up right view. Where right view is lacking, morality inclines towards dogmatic attachment to rituals, sila bata paramasa. Concentration turns out to be wrong concentration, miccha samadhi. Like the one who sits facing the sun, one might be looking in the direction of the Dhamma, but my view is not something one inherits by merely going to refuge to the Buddha. It has to be developed with effort and proper attention. View is something that has to be straightened up. For Dittuju Kamma, the act of straightening up one's view, is reckoned as one of the 10 skillful deeds, Kusala Kamma. So however long one may sit with folded legs, gazing at the Buddha sun, one might not be able to see the 6 rainbow colors of the Dhamma. One may be short of just 1/100th of an inch as the proper adjustment for right view, yet it is a must. Once that adjustment is made, one immediately, then and there, tavat eva, catches a glimpse of the spectrum of the Dhamma that the Buddha has proclaimed. We have stressed the importance of right view in particular because many are grappling with the self-created problem concerning the proper alignment between the triple training and the right view of the Noble Eightfold Path. Now as to the triple training, morality, concentration and wisdom, we find wisdom mentioned last. It seems then that we have to perfect morality first, then develop concentration, and only lastly wisdom. One need not think of wisdom before that. But when we come to the Noble Eightfold Path, we find a different order of values. Here, right view takes precedence. As a matter of fact, in the Mahācattārisaka Sutta of the Majjhima Nikāya, we find the Buddha repeatedly declaring emphatically, Tatra bhikkhave sammaditthi pubbangama. Monks, therein right view takes precedence. Even in a context where the subject is morality, we find a similar statement. So how are we to resolve this issue? In the Noble Eightfold Path, pride of place is given to right view, which is representative of the wisdom group. As the well-known definition goes, right view and right thoughts belong to the wisdom group. Right speech, right action, and right livelihood come under the morality group. Right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration belong to the concentration group. So in this way, in the Noble Eightfold Path, wisdom comes first, then morality, and lastly concentration. But in the context of these three groups, firstly comes morality, secondly concentration, and lastly wisdom. Here too, the answer given by the Arahant Venerable Dhammadinna to the lay disciple Visakha comes to our aid. The lay disciple Visakha poses the following question to Venerable Dhammadinna. Aryena nuko aya attangikena maggena tayokanda sangaita. Udavati kande aryo attangiko maggo sangaito. Good lady, are the three groups morality, concentration, and wisdom included by the Noble Eightfold Path? Or is the Noble Eightfold Path included by the three groups? Comment and translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. Lady, are the three aggregates included by the Noble Eightfold Path? Or is the Noble Eightfold Path included by the three aggregates? And here I give the Chinese, which is closely similar. End of comment. Even at that time, there may have been some who raised such questions. That is probably the reason for such a query. Then the Arahant Dhammadinna answers, Na ko avosa Visakha aryena tangikena maggena tayokanda sangaita. Tihi cha ko avosa Visakha kandehi arya tangiko maggo sangaitum. Friend Visakha, it is not that the threefold training is included by the Noble Eightfold Path, but the Noble Eightfold Path is included by the threefold training. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. The three aggregates are not included by the Noble Eightfold Path, friend Visakha, but the Noble Eightfold Path is included by the three aggregates. And here again the Chinese, which states the same. End of comment. Since this appears to be something of a tangle, let us try to illustrate the position with some other kind of tangle. Suppose someone is trying to climb up a long rope made of 3 strands. As he climbs up, his fingertips might come now in contact with the first strand, now with the second, and now with the third. He is not worried about the order of the 3 strands, so long as they are well knit. One can safely climb up, holding on to the 3 strands, only when they are firmly wound up into a sturdy rope. All these questions seem to have arisen due to an attitude of taking too seriously the numerical order of things. To the noble disciple climbing up the rope of the Noble Eightfold Path, there need not be any confusion between the numerical order of the triple training and that of the Noble Eightfold Path. But if someone taking the cue from the order of the triple training neglects right view or ignores its prime import, he might end up confused. All in all, we are now in a position to correctly assess the deep significance of the Barre Sutta. Here we have the quintessence of the entire Saddhamma. We are not confronted with the heap of perceptual data, which we are told today are essential requisites for admission into the city of Nibbāna. For the ordinary worldling, amassing a particular set of percepts or concepts seems a qualification for entering Nibbāna. But what we have here is a way of liberating the mind even from latencies to percepts. Sanya nanusenti Marupinika Sutta, perceptions do not lie latent. There is no heaping up anew. What are called extraneous taints, agantuka upakkilesa, are not confined to the well-known defilements in the world. They include all the rust and dust we have been collecting throughout this long samsara, with the help of the influxes, asava. They include even the heap of percepts which the world calls knowledge. Even numerals are part of it. The Buddha has briefly expressed here the mode of practice for disabusing the mind from all such taints. Therefore, there is no reason for underestimating the value of this discourse by calling it Vihara Desana, conventional teaching. This discourse in the Udana is one that is truly uplifting. It indeed deserves a paean of joy.